All right, hello, welcome to this next video. So Blender 4.3, the release candidate has now been released. I believe the original planned date for the release was yesterday, but that got pushed back a week. So today is the release candidate release, and next week will be the actual release of Blender 4.3. And as you can imagine, Blender has released a huge number of bug fixes, updates, and new features. So I've tried to go over as many as I can in this video. There is, of course, too many to include in one video, so I've tried to include the ones which I think are most important. I'm going to put a chapter for each section, so if you're interested in sculpting or UI or cycles, I'm going to put a chapter for each so you know exactly where to go. Now, of course, we are iMesh, and we can't do these videos without the amazing support from our iMesh subscribers. And right now we have a huge Black Friday sale, 50% off our entire library. And our library is worth about $16,000 if you're going to buy all the assets individually. And we do also have now our first big courses released, which are also 50% off. So if you're looking to take your ArcViz career to the next level, then please do check out iMesh. Right, now let's jump straight into the video. We're going to be talking about the volume scatter node, and this scene is actually from our brand new course over at iMesh. Please do check that out. It's now 50% off. So if you want to learn how to make a huge scene like this, including neighboring buildings, scenery, the actual building itself, and everything like that, like people and post-production, then please do check out iMesh. So what we have here is the volume scatter node, and that now has some new phase functions. So this is the one by default, and that's good for generic atmospheric scattering. Okay, then we have this one, which is good for underwater environments. And then we have this one, which is good for things like interstellar dust. Okay, then we have this one here, which is apparently good for scattering of sunlight through Earth's atmosphere, for example. Okay, and this one is my favorite option. However, it does seem to always have a little bit of blotchiness due to the denoiser. I think with a full render it might look a bit better, but this is me, and this is good for fog and clouds, because one thing I was really struggling with when I made this scene with the default settings is because the fog is only about this high, the sky should be a lot brighter because above the fog is just a clear sky, so we should be able to see some brightness from there, and I do find that me actually works pretty well there, so I do think this one works a lot better for this kind of thing. Okay, so the diffuse BSDF in the previous version was not multi-scattering, but in the new one it is, and that will end up giving a slightly brighter and more saturated results to existing materials. Okay, and also the principal BSDF now has a diffuse roughness as well, and this works independent from the roughness slider here, which is related to the specular reflection. So if I turn this down, we can see the surface gets a lot more glossy. However, if I slide this one back up, we can see the diffuse color itself. We can change the roughness value for that. But this is a very interesting slider, and I love how we're able to change the appearance of the color itself for the actual object. So we can see a lot more color on the top here, whereas if I make this 0, we can see that the edges get a little more darker. If anyone wants to write a little bit more of how this works in the comments, that'd be great. If you're using Linux, there is now support for hardware accelerated ray tracing, HIP-RT, and we can see that there is a speed improvement. So if you're using Linux, that is now an option. Okay, with the camera, if you set it to panoramic, you have all these old options, but there's now a new one called central cylindrical. If you're somebody that does a lot of panoramic renders, then I'm sure you have a good idea how you're going to use this, but that's now an option. So previously inside of Blender, we had this thing called max roughness. And if you slide this all the way to the top, then fast GI approximation is turned off. So it says here, a value of 1 will disable the fast GI approximation. However, in the latest version of Blender, there's now just a checkbox. So if you want to enable fast GI approximation, you turn it on. If you want to turn it off, you just simply turn it off. So we can see by turning it off, it makes a slightly more realistic result. Okay, so in Blender, there's a thing called light linking. So I can move these objects to a collection, move to collection 2, click on this lamp, and I'm going to go to shading, light linking. I'm going to choose collection 2. Now we can see that only this collection is getting the light. Well, this now works inside of Eevee as well. So we can see here that the light is only affecting this selection. And this also works with shadow linking too. So we can see this light is affecting all of these, but the shadows only being shown up by these cubes here. But if I turn these off, we can see that it's now affecting all the other objects, but there's no shadow for this one. So light linking is a welcome addition to Eevee. Okay, so for the next section, we're talking about geometry nodes. Now, I'm not a geometry nodes expert, so some people probably have some really good ideas of what you can do with these things. So I'm just going to explain the new nodes which are available, and then you can probably come up with some ideas of what you can do with that. But this was an example created on the release notes for this node, so I've just recreated that. And basically, you're creating a grid. So if I view this, it's basically going to create a grid. So I have 3 points this way, 3 points this way. So for each element, so for each point, I'm going to find a value. So I'm going to get the index. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And for each one, I'm going to add 3 points to the star. And I'm going to use the position of these points to tell it where the star should be. So if I view this, we can now see we have a star. So if I turn this one down, we can say 2, and I can say 1. So it starts with 1, and then it slowly increases as it goes on. So I can say 2, 3, 4. So as this goes on, the number of points increases. But this probably has a million use cases. I would love to experiment with this and see what other options I can create. Okay, so the grease pencil now works with geometry nodes as well. So if I create this monkey, I can then go to geometry nodes, click new. I can then type in resample curve and plug that into here. And then we can change different aspects of the actual grease pencil here. So being able to extract the grease pencil data into geometry nodes, I think is going to create a whole host of different things you can create. Now, I've never actually used the bake node or the simulation nodes, but you can actually bake from this. So if you have simulations and things like that, you can bake the data, but you can now also pack this data into the actual .blend file itself, which is, I'm sure, pretty useful if you use that. Okay, this is our array modifier that we created inside of Blender, but in here it has, if you go to spreadsheet, it just has geometry for all the names here. However, it would be nice to set a name, and now we can. So we can go to here and do Shift A, set geometry name, and we can plug that into something like this, and we can say instance geonodes, for example, and then all these instances then get that name. Okay, then there are apparently some utility nodes, which I'm not too sure what the benefit of these are. Well, maths integer, so this is an integer math one. So if you multiply, these are all going to be whole values. So you can't do 2.2, for example. I understand that. Hash value, I'm not too sure what a hash is, but that now exists. And there's also a matrix determinant node. So if you like to use a matrix and you want it to be determinant, then I guess you'd use this node, probably. Okay, now there are also gizmos inside of geometry nodes as well now. So you can add gizmos that are in the 3D viewport. So this allows you to edit the inputs of a node directly from the 3D viewport. So this is good for things like tools and things like that. So there's also a warning node or error or information node. So if, for example, when you're working with geometry nodes, there's something very specific that someone needs to know when they're using it, you can write an error message like this, and then someone can actually see the information. So if I plug this one into here, I then get an option like show, for example, and that then shows in this down here. I can then also click these and do Control G. I can make a node group, and then we can also see that error message up here, or the warning that people need to know when they're working with this node group. Okay, so in the past with the grease pencil, you can add many different layers, many layers, which can get a little bit messy. So in Blender 4.3, you can also then add a group, and you can drop these things into the groups. You can then also assign them colors as well, which seems like a nice addition. Now, I don't really use grease pencil very much, but I'm sure this is a very, very welcome addition. Okay, now in the grease pencil option, if you go to draw, you can now see there's a bunch of different options here. So we can paint things out. We can also blur these out like this. And we can basically very easily see exactly what we're doing, which somebody who doesn't really use grease pencil that much, if ever, being able for somebody like me to be able to see these and see exactly what they do is a huge help. Now, these brushes, for example, let's say you create one yourself, you can actually then view it in the asset browser as well. You just need to make sure that you mark your brush as an asset, and then you can view them in here as well. Okay, now also inside the brush, if you see my brush size, it's not changing in size. We can see this circle here is still always the same size. If I set this to scene, this will be using the radius value of 0.01. Now we see if I zoom out, the brush gets a lot smaller. So we can see I'm drawing this size. I'm always going to be drawing this size. And we can see now that the brush is always the same size. If I set this to view, if I zoom out, my brush is very, very big. If I zoom in, it's very, very small. So being able to set it to scene or view is very nice. Now also there's a thing called spacing. And if you set this to, let me just increase the brush size. It'll make sure that every point that is drawn is at most one brush size away. However, if I set this to 500, for example, the points are going to be much further spaced out. So we can see it creates this much more different effect, like this, you can kind of see it working there. If I lower this much lower, the performance will be much worse, but we can see each point is going to be defined. If we go to edit mode, we can see here the spacing here is much bigger than here. But the performance when setting this too low, like less than 100% or less than 50%, gets a lot worse. So be careful of that. Okay, now I have already shown this, but there is a soft eraser, so you can see that the edges kind of get a bit blurred out, which is quite nice. If you set this to be point, it will remove exactly to the point, which I believe is how it used to work. You can also set it to stroke to remove all the whole points completely. So having this be blurred out is pretty good. Now with the grease pencil, apparently you can also add a gradient to a certain object. Now for some reason I can't get this to work. Maybe someone else who has some experience with grease pencil can help, but I've got it set to fill, I've set it to gradient. Apparently you can choose this dropper here and then choose like the start and end point for the gradient, but nothing I do seems to be working. So anyway, you can now add a gradient. I'm sure somebody else can tell me how this works. Okay, so apparently the active smooth has been changed. So if you go to advanced, we can see active smooth. So if I set this to be 1, we can see that Blender's going to be smoothing the result no matter what I do here. It's going to be trying to smooth it out. If I go down here, I set it to 0, for example, it's not going to be smoothing it out. You can see the edges are a lot more jagged. But apparently this algorithm has been rewritten, so it should have a much more accurate feel. Now for the grease pencil, for the rest of the stuff, there's just a whole bunch of random little miscellaneous fixes and changes, and there's also some performance increases, some performance improvements and things like that. So if you're interested in grease pencil, please do look at this. Otherwise, I feel like at this point, my whole video is going to be a grease pencil video. Okay, so there's a new unwrap method, which I am a huge fan of. So I actually had this problem very recently on some trees that we were making for iMesh, and I wanted to unwrap something like this. And with the usual method, unwrap, angle based, for example, you can see that there's kind of a bulge here, that the squares here are this size, and then down here, the squares get bigger. That isn't really ideal because it should all be kind of the same size throughout. But there's now a new option called unwrap minimum stretch. So now the unwrap looks like this. Now the square sizes are a lot closer to what it should actually be. Now, of course, this is quite an extreme case because the geometry is much more spaced out here than over here, but we can see this is a huge improvement. So if I go to the previous one, angle based, we can see one giant square here, and we can see that the image texture is becoming a lot more obvious, the resolution. So if I press U, unwrap, minimum stretch, we can see here that it's much smaller now, and we have to get a lot closer before you start seeing the texture resolution. So I'm very happy that this is now here. I'm really sad that the trees that we were working on very recently was for a previous version of Blender, but never mind, this is now an option. So that's gonna be great for going forwards. Now, if you like to make procedural materials, then there's a new texture which is called Gabor texture, and you can change different aspects of this. So we can choose we can change different aspects of this. There's also different outputs here. For example, something like this, which is pretty cool. This almost looks like a camo style. And we can change something on the 3D viewport like that if we wanted to. Now, by creating something like this, as I can see in the release notes, we can create very easily like a crosshatch texture. So I'm sure someone who wants to create some sort of fabric texture can now do that simply by creating something like this. All right then, so previously, if you wanted a metallic material, you'd get the principal BSDF and slide that value up. However, there are certain aspects of the metalness in which we can't really get from the principal shader. So there's a dedicated metallic principal BSDF. If I plug that into this, we can now see we have some other options. So we can change the edge tint color of the metal. We can also change a bunch of other options for the metal specifically. And not only that, if you know exactly what you're doing, you can change the physical conductor, and you can change different aspects of the metal in a very specific way. If you know what you're doing here, I'm sure you can create a very, very accurate metal by using this. This is beyond me, but it's nice to know that we now have some dedicated metal options for very specific metal objects. Now under the sculpting, there's now the same like the grease pencil. We can see all the brushes listed here. So we can see here, we can see all libraries, and we can see actually this is referring to the asset browser. So under mesh sculpt, we can see we have general, we have paint, we have simulation, and we can see that is listed here. So all of them which are in these catalogs, we can do that. We can also add our own here, and we can choose which ones to show up. So, and also, which is incredibly useful, is now we can see these in much bigger thumbnails. So someone like me who doesn't use this too much will have a much better idea of what they actually do. So we can create some very cool effects like that, or something like this. if you wanted to, simply by looking at what they do. I really love this this correction. I don't use sculpting too much, and I always find the way in which I select brushes always a little bit confusing. So I do very much appreciate that this is now an option. I'm really sorry, Suzanne, but I think you might need to go to hospital. Now, also, if you're into brushes and sculpting specifically, there's a whole bunch of little corrections and new brushes and everything like that that's added. I'd recommend going through these and actually looking at them yourself. Because if I do a video on each of these points, I'll probably be here forever. So it's worth checking out if you're quite interested in sculpting. Okay, so in previous versions of Blender, let's say, for example, I wanted to find this color. I would press E, for example, and click on here. We can see this, it gets a little bit darker. Now, for example, if I go down to color management and turn down the exposure, then press E and click on this, we can see it's much, much darker because it's taking into consideration the actual view transform, which is not very useful because I want to get exactly this color at this point without the view transform, because I know, for example, let's say I added a label and the label had a red color. I want to get exactly that red color. I don't want it to be interfered with the view transform. So inside of Blender 4.3, for example, if I bring down the exposure like this, we can hardly see it, press E and click on this, we can see that the color is not dark. It's still actually going to be the same color as what it should be. So it's not taking into consideration this, which is really, really nice, because sometimes you might have a dark scene. You know this is exactly the right blue shade that you're looking for, and then you press E, you click on it, and suddenly it's much darker than it is. Now it does, of course, take into consideration the brightness values. So if I do click on this side, of course it will get darker. But actually color picking and trying to choose the right color that you're looking for. And it's much more useful doing it this way than having the view transform take effect. Okay, now a small update. We had save, and then save incremental was right here, but they've now moved it to prevent accidental clicking. Save, save as, save copy, and save incremental is right at the bottom. Now for the user interface. Now one thing I absolutely love is this option here. You hover over and it gives you a bigger thumbnail. So the amount of times I'm working with, for example, something like this, you might have Asphalt 023S, and then I might have made a very small correction. I might call that number 2. And then I'm thinking, which one is it? The thumbnail's too small. Well, now you can actually view it here. Okay, now it looks like there's also a new change. If you go to themes and then to styles, active editor outline, and if you move your mouse over them, you can now change the color of the active element. So let's change the alpha to be like this. We can now see exactly which one we're in. Now, by default, this is still very, very subtle, but I absolutely love this. Just by changing it to blue, I feel like this is far more intuitive. I feel like this is just a nice visual way of seeing it. It's quite subtle, but I just think that it's great. And now one of my new favorite updates as well is for the UI, where we can move things around. So if you click on this edge box here, and by the way, this section, the hitbox to find this little gizmo here is now bigger, so it's easier to select it. But if you click and drag, we can now drag this anywhere we like. So I want to put this material editor here, for example. I can then also just click and drag in one of the corners and say I'm going to move it over to here. And not only that, if I click and drag it outside, I can move it over here. So this is now outside, which is very, very nice. Now, if you do drag this outside of Blender, you want to put it back, you simply click back on this corner, drag it back into Blender and put it back where you wanted. Okay, now for Blender, if you have, for example, this panel and you want to separate it, for example, you go to header and click duplicate area into a new window, we can now see we now have the shade editor, which is great, but it's still called Blender. However, in Blender 4.3, if I was to do the same thing, like for example, click here, we can now see it has now created it, but it's now called Shader Editor, so you can actually see what it's called. I can also change this to be UV Editor, and it just keeps the name, which is quite nice. Now, those are my favorite UI changes, but there are also a whole bunch of different changes and fixes, which I don't think I should go over in one video. I do recommend you check this out because the UI is changing so much over all these versions to become more and more fluid and much more user-friendly. I'd recommend just checking this out because you might find a function which you like to use a lot. So custom curve control points are now larger. That's nice too. Okay, if you go to Edit, Preferences, and then into Interface, if you enable developer options, then you go to System, and then for backend, you can now choose Vulkan. You need to restart it and then you can choose a device. And this is basically using a new Vulkan option instead of OpenGL. Now Blender is transitioning from OpenGL to Vulkan because OpenGL is no longer actively developed, limiting support for new GPU features like hardware ray tracing and HDR displays. And Vulkan also offers a modern, efficient API that enables better performance and access to advanced GPU capabilities. So this aligns with Blender's future development goals. Now this is in experimental right now, so you can just enable it and just experiment with it. If you start finding some bugs with the interface, then it'd be nice to create some sort of bug report. So in previous versions of Blender, if I have a bone constraint and I choose another armature, for example this one, and then I want to select the bone, it's just a drop-down menu. However, in Blender 4.3, if I select the armature, let's do that again here, it then gives me an eyedropper, which allows me to choose the exact bone that I want instead of having just a drop-down list, which is a nice quality of life update. Okay, so a little update. If we have these keyframes selected and then I move the object and then press I, we can still see they are all selected, including the new one that was created. In Blender 4.3, if we have all of these already selected, but we make a new keyframe, press I, it now only selects the newly created keyframes, which I think is quite useful. Okay, so if we have an object which is animated like this, if we go to object properties and we have motion paths and we can calculate that, and we can see the motion path here. If I go to edit preferences and then go to themes, and then under before current frame and after current frame, I can actually change the colors of this now. So I can set this to be green if I wanted to. If I go back, I can also set this to be after current frame. I can set that to be blue if I wanted to. And we can see now that we can now choose different colors if we wanted to. Okay, so under various properties, we can now find a new animation section. So for example, we have object properties. We also have a world properties, so we have animation section here, and we also have one under the materials as well. And this is animation selectors, which are types of data blocks which can be assigned to different objects. So if we have a look here, we can see that these two objects have different animations. However, if I go to this section here and click on the animation for the sphere, we can see it has the actions of the actual sphere, but I can actually give it now the cube. So now they both share those same animations. So that we can do that for basically anything now. So under materials or even a world, and even for the cameras and lights and everything like that. Okay, so previously with the file output node, there's no way to save it in something like non-color data, for example. So if we have we can choose, for example, PNG, and then we can choose some of these PNG settings. And for the color management, we'd choose maybe override. We can have all these different options like Filmic AGX, but there's nothing to say, for example, non-color. We can't choose the actual color space. So if I turn off this, we now have a new color space option where we can actually choose then, for example, we want this to be non-color. This is quite useful for data type images like normal maps or other things like that. Okay, so if you have an Eevee scene, so in the past, this is 4.2. If you have any other passes, for example, AO, and you try to mix that in, you will get given an error to say that that is not supported. Inside Blender 4.3, however, that is supported. So I can mix in multiple different passes. In this case, it's just AO, so now I can see the AO pass, and this is all going to be mixed in nicely. Okay, in the Compositor, there is a color balance node, of course, and if you now go to here, you can see white point, where you can choose the white balance in the Compositor, the input and output if you wanted to, but also in the render settings, there is also a white balance slider here as well, so you can adjust the white balance in this section as well. I've been waiting for a white balance update for a long time, so it's very nice to see that now part of Blender. And this scene is available on iMesh right now, so if you get the subscription, which is now 50% off because of Black Friday, you'll be able to get this scene plus a whole bunch of other scenes and 2,300 assets. Now, I hope that you're just as excited about that release as I am. I think that there's some very welcome updates, including the fog or the diffuse roughness, or for example, even the UI having the outline around your active element. I think that's incredible. And like I said, do check out iMesh. We have 50% off sale. We only do this once a year. So if you're thinking about getting your hand into ArcViz, now is probably the time. You can create as many renders as you possibly need for all of your clients, and you can start actually making money from that. We actually have people in our Discord who regularly mention to say they've been trying to learn ArcViz and they're finally starting to get their first customers, which is amazing. And they say it couldn't be done without iMesh. So that definitely warms my heart to see. So now is definitely the time to check out iMesh if you're looking to also start a career in that as well.